And they're determined to illustrate to the world that modernization and westernization are not synonymous. And that modernization can take different forms in different countries. When he says our single highest priority is to improve the lives of the ordinary people, when he says that, this is a deeply felt, personal, emotional comment. This is not a conceptual comment. They started with the premise there's somebody in the world who knows this topic better than we do. Let's get that somebody to Beijing. Let's drain his brain. Let's study what he had to say, see if it applies to us, refine it and customize for our circumstance, and then execute. In the same way that if you look back through Chinese history, there was an emperor, and then there was the kind of the Mandarin class running the country. Mm-hmm. That's essentially what you have at the moment. And you don't get into the Chinese Communist Party if you're not very able. So that the examination-based culture, which has existed for 2,000 years, still exists, and essentially that's what drives the input into all these institutions. And so to put it in the vernacular, if you get to the top of the Chinese system, there's no chance you're not very smart and very able. So I started this fashion on the year 2050. And I said to myself, okay, well, what will the world be like in 2050? Well, the best estimates are there'll be something like 10 billion people. And today there are approximately 8 billion. So we have an incremental 2 billion people. And those people are going to come primarily from 9 countries. And those countries are India, Nigeria, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Uganda, Tanzania, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Indonesia, the United States. So essentially, we're going to add 2 billion poor people, primarily in Africa and Central Asia. And at the same time, the concentration of wealth will get worse. So, for example, the US and China today are something like 42% of global GDP. In the year 2050, no one really knows, of course, but it's going to be somewhere between 50 and 60%. So 2 countries will have 50 or 60% of the world's wealth, and there'll be 2 billion more poor people. Now, we already know what it looks like when you have that kind of inequality, both within countries and across countries. Just about everything you can think about is not good. Migration, disease, terrorism, climate change, etc. So I look at that and I say to myself, if we had any kind of, as it were, strategic planning going on for the world, raise your hand if you think it's a good idea that in that world I just described, that the world's, pick your number, most powerful, wealthiest 10 countries, 5 countries, or how about the 2 countries? Who thinks it's a good idea that in that world, those 2 countries should spend most of their time fighting with each other? It can't make any sense at all. And so I look at that world and I say to myself, well, wait a minute. Right now, the way I feel about it, it's like we're heading over a cliff. We're persuading ourselves, and it's kind of like a escalating negative game. Both sides are persuading themselves that the other one's nefarious, malevolent, and it's getting worse and worse, and it can't make any sense. And so then I scratch my head and say, well, now how are we going to get ourselves out of this trap? Out of this trap, and it's not obvious, particularly when you have regard to what I said a minute ago about Hofstadter, because our own country domestically is going to be, in my opinion, politically ill for a while. So with that, if I can call it that reality, that makes the task that much more difficult. So there are only 2 things I'm kind of I'm hoping will exist. One is that other countries will in fact increasingly over time, more forcefully, say to the United States and China, I'm sorry, it's simply not acceptable for the 2 of you not to have a constructive relationship. The world cannot exist if that's the case, and you got to stop it. And you see some of that happening right now. One of the things that kind of interests me, I don't want to take a tangent, but I'll just quickly go through this, if you look at the Russian-Ukrainian war, and if you were following just the English language media, English language communication channels, which dominate the world's communication channels, you could be forgiven for thinking that the sanctions on Russia are basically a good idea and are essentially working. And most people see it that way. Until you get into the fine print and you realize that of the 54 African countries, the number supporting the sanctions is 0. Of the 32 Latin American countries, the number supporting the sanctions is 0. Of the 22 Middle Eastern countries, the number supporting the sanctions is 0. The 48 Asian countries, number supporting the sanctions are 3. South Korea, Japan, Singapore. 16 Pacific Island countries, 2. Australia and New Zealand. So I just named you 175 countries, 5 of which are supporting the sanctions. So the sanctions are essentially an American, Western European, and a few American allies, essentially in Asia and Australasia. Now, the relevance of that is that it does show you a certain kind of fissure that exists that you don't hear a lot about. And the positive side of which may be, this is the question, may be, that all those other countries over time will say to both the United States and China, as I said earlier, it's just not acceptable for you all not to have a decent relationship. And China, by the way, is already the largest trading partner with 140 of those countries. And China, I was just in China earlier this week, listening to there's a new sort of, well, a more prominent form of a term of art the Chinese are using called Chinese modernization. And they're determined to illustrate to the world that modernization and westernization are not synonymous. And that modernization can take different forms in different countries. And I was listening to the foreign minister lay all this out, and among the other things he cited was, in no particular order, China's contributed more to global growth in the last decade than all G7 countries put together. 1.4 billion people in China are more than all the developed world put together. They're the leading trader with 140 countries. The trade between China and ASEAN, this is amazing, the trade between China and ASEAN is bigger than the trade between the United States and the EU. So when you start going down through these things, you realize there's a certain reality here that sooner or later the Americans are going to have to accept. And my own opinion is the sooner that gets understood and accepted, the better, and that the relationship has got to get better, because if it doesn't get better, then everything I was saying about 2050, let alone 2070 or 2100, is just going off a cliff. I'm going to stop there.
Great. All right. So there's so much to dig in there, and I think I want to come back to China's relationship with other countries, because I think that's been pivotal and it sets the stage for many topics that we need to talk about. But I want to start back in 2012 when Xi Jinping came to power. And this is a premier that you have watched and studied and know. Help us understand who he is and, as a leader, what he wants.
Okay. So this can make me very unpopular. So Xi Jinping, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier. I want you to keep your minds open for a second and try to imagine this. And some of you may know this. So Xi Jinping's father was the youngest vice premier in China in 1959 when he was 46 years old. And Xi Jinping was 6 years old. 1962, Xi Jinping's father was purged by Mao. So Xi Jinping, between age 6 and 9, his father's right in the center of the power structure, and suddenly he's out altogether. 4 years later, 1966, is the Cultural Revolution. Xi Jinping is 13 years old. The father and the mother sent to prison. 2 years later, Xi Jinping at age 15 is sent to the countryside, sent down youth. So he lives in the countryside from age 15 to age 22. So for those 7 years, those 7 extremely formative years, he's living the dirt poor existence of the Chinese farmer, with both parents imprisoned. Older half-sister commits suicide. So there's Xi Jinping in his teenage college years, by the way, of course, not being educated. There's no schooling, there's no university. And, where's his future? During that period, he applies 15 times to be in the Communist Party. He gets turned down 15 times. Eventually, of course, Mao dies. Deng Xiaoping comes back into power. Deng Xiaoping brings the father out from prison. Xi Jinping is now free to go to university and start his life. The father, meanwhile, Deng Xiaoping makes him the governor of Guangdong province. Guangdong province is the province right across from Hong Kong. And Xi Jinping's father is the individual who goes to Deng Xiaoping and says, we should make this a special economic zone, an experiment with market economics. So his father is the individual who goes to Deng Xiaoping and says, that's the kind of the first spark of the reform and opening period. Later on, when Deng Xiaoping essentially removes Hu Yaobang from power, and then Tiananmen Square happens, Xi Jinping's father is the only one of that generation who tells Deng he's wrong. And he gets banished again. So I want you to think about the sort of the strength of character of somebody who goes through what I just described and comes out the other side of it pretty much intact, stays in the system, rises up to the position he's in. I have 4 children, the youngest of whom is a sophomore in university. This past semester, he had a course on the Cultural Revolution. And the final paper was, write a paper on what you think the impact was on the sent-down youth of the Cultural Revolution. And so my son interviewed 6 or 7 sent-down youth, half of whom are living in this country and half of whom are living in China. And of course, in his paper, he basically says, look, you can't generalize for 17 million people on the basis of talking to 7, but these are what these 7 people told me. And then he says, it's interesting to speculate, what was the impact on the sent-down youth of those sent-down youth who stayed in the system and got to the top of the system, like Xi Jinping? And my son says the following things in his paper, which I agree with. He says, the first thing is, if you're Xi Jinping, when he says our single highest priority is to improve the lives of the ordinary people, when he says that, this is a deeply felt, personal, emotional comment. This is not a conceptual comment. And this is not, any of the U.S. leaders in my lifetime, none of them live that life. And so when they talk about improving the lives of ordinary Americans, this is an intellectual concept. They believe it to more or less extent. For Xi Jinping, this is a highly personal comment. That's number one. The second one is, if you live through the insanity of the Cultural Revolution, and you're a leader of China, priority 1 through 5 or 1 through 10 is social and political stability. So those 2 things, to me, are the most defining characteristics of this person. The third one being Xi Jinping's desire for China as a country to reestablish itself, remembering that in 18 of the last 20 centuries, China was the world's largest economy. It's only in the last 2 centuries, 19th and 20th, where it wasn't so. So in the Chinese mind, they're reestablishing the norm. They're not sort of in Graham Allison's phase, coming into a pre-existing system, upsetting it.
So one of the things then that I think it would be helpful for us to understand is, what are the policies that he's implemented and why? And you mentioned the number of countries that have remained neutral with respect to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. One can't but wonder how much the One Belt, One Road initiatives, which supported the trade both within Asia and China's connection to natural resources and the rest of the world economy through this initiative have played a role in that outcome. Can you talk about what you see as the importance of what that initiative looks like?
Okay, well, One Belt, One Road is a perfect example of something. And I didn't know this until I was told this by John Kerry. So John Kerry told me that in, I think it was 2013, he was the senior American at one of these international meetings that Obama could not attend for one reason or another. And so he was the person who took the meeting with Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping in that meeting said to John Kerry, by the way, let me tell you about something I'm thinking about. And he laid out the One Belt, One Road. And Kerry said to him, oh, that's very interesting. Why don't we do this together? And Xi Jinping says, that's a great idea. Let's do this together. And Kerry came back to Washington, and he said before he got off the plane, the Treasury Mandarin said, cut his legs off, and there was no chance it was going to happen. So it never got to Obama's desk as kind of a strategic question. But I tell you that story because if you were reading today the characterization of One Belt, One Road, you would think this was some kind of malevolent tactic to get control of the world on the part of the Chinese, which it is not. It is exactly what it's said, what they say it is, which is to extend a model of development into as many countries as it wanted, who desperately need it. And when I talked earlier about Chinese modernization that I attended this last Monday, so Chinese modernization, I won't go into all the details, but there basically are 5 central characteristics of it, one of which is a peaceful world. Second one of which is common prosperity. Third one of which is harmony between man and nature. So the foreign minister went through this whole thing, and then there were 5 of us asked to comment on it. And I said, in my comments, I said, listen, those of us who have ever run anything know, plans are one thing, execution is another. Execution is the whole thing. So my advice to you, the Chinese, would be, if you're going to hold yourself out as believing in these things, I mean, who's against any of these things? Who's against world peace? Who's against harmony between man and nature? Who's against common prosperity? Nobody. 10 out of 10 people. There's nobody in this room who's going to be against any of these things. So that's not the issue. The issue is, are you actually going to do what you say you do? And if you don't, you're going to suffer the same negative blowback that countries like the United States get when they were seen as being hypocritical. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, which is extremely important, and a point I want to make to all of you, which I made to the Chinese till I'm blue in the face very unsuccessfully, which is, when I first started spending a lot of time in China I was chairman of Goldman Sachs Asia in the mid-90s into 2000. At a point in time when the Chinese system was just starting to open up, and they were just starting to put state-owned enterprises into Western markets, and Zhu Rongji was the premier, or vice premier, then premier, and he was a very unusual person, and he really cared about getting this right, and I happened to be there, and I was very senior, so I was in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to give him advice in a way that will probably never occur again because the Chinese were so in need of the advice. But one thing that struck me about them was the Chinese leadership on almost every topic, not every topic, but almost every topic, was systematically open in the following sense. They started with the premise there's somebody in the world who knows this topic better than we do. Let's get that somebody to Beijing. Let's drain his brain. Let's study what he had to say, see if it applies to us, refine it and customize for our circumstance, and then execute. And they did this time after time after time, which is why back in those days you would have seen both Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji routinely meeting with Western CEOs, Western superb academics, Nobel Prize winners and so forth, Western head of NGOs. They met with them routinely, one-on-one, because they knew they were getting very high quality information coming in from people who didn't work for them, and good information was coming back the other way. That started to stop a few years ago. That's another topic. But my point is systematically open, except I said to them, listen, one topic you missed, which is the English language dominates the world's communication channels. And you recognize that. You literally don't participate in them at all. So the Chinese story, as it were, is told by people who are not Chinese. And guess what? They don't know the story as well. They don't tell it as well. And so it's entirely absent. And until you start to get into those channels, you're going to be at a big, big disadvantage. So when you talk about Chinese modernization, coming back to that, if you believe it, number one, you've got to deliver on it. And number two, you've got to communicate it in such a way that the external world, particularly the English language world, takes it in and believes it. And right now you're failing miserably on that count. And until that gets corrected, it's never going to solve that problem.
So one of the things I think most Americans were taught when they learned about China was that it is a communist, originally Marxist form of government and society. But one of the things that many of us have missed is how not just embracing of markets China has been, but how dominant China has become at capitalism in its own flavor of capitalism in terms of state-owned enterprises and allowing for other kinds of free market operations. And the One Belt, One Road initiative is in many ways an expression of that. The incredible trade integration and market integration with the US is another expression of that. Can you talk about how that transformation has happened and how we missed it and what it means for China in particular?
Well, let me say a couple of things. First of all, I just want to read you one quick thing. This, by the way, another one of my pet peeves is that last November I was having breakfast in New York with a very senior Chinese official, just one-on-one with a note taker. And in the first 5 minutes, the official said to me, "It's so frustrating to us that senior Americans never read anything that we put out. Instead, what they do is they listen to so-called experts, Western experts, who interpret our documents for these, let's say, the senior people in this country." Mm-hmm. And he gave a specific example. He said, for example, Kevin Rudd, this is him talking. Kevin Rudd, who I know very well. He's a good guy. He knows China quite well. And Kevin Rudd's got a whole theory about what we're doing now. And a lot of people listen to him. He said, the problem is Kevin Rudd's wrong. And I don't know how to correct that. And when he said that, I said, I recognize exactly what you're saying. It relates to what I was just saying a minute ago. But in addition to which, here I've got a book, for example, written by a senior Chinese, comparing the Warring States period in China with ancient Greece. So a frustration of mine is, as much as I know or don't know about China, and I know that an outsider to a culture can never be an insider. So the most you can ever hope to be is kind of a synthetic insider by building relationships with people. But one thing I know after all these years is that as much as I think I know on something, if I don't test it with a close Chinese friend, I'm going to be off. Sometimes a little bit and sometimes a lot. And so I tried as much as I can to read things that the Chinese themselves actually write. And by the way, this is an aside, with respect to the Chinese government, when they say they're going to do something, chances are very high they're going to do it. And in contrast, for example, to our State of the Union, which is basically a speech about the future and about hope, the Chinese have a thing they call the equivalent in China is the Chinese work report, which tells you exactly what they actually did for real and what they're going to do for real. It's a completely different document. All right. Now, I just want to read you one thing here, though, that sort of captures, I think, a very good sentiment. Bear with me here 1 second. Okay, here we are. The power configuration in the current world should not be defined as competition between China and the United States for hegemony. Rather, we witness a shift from the situation in which a single civilization dominated the globe to common prosperity of diverse civilizations. What China has inaugurated is not a Chinese century, but a century of diverse civilizations, a new era in which there will no longer be a single civilizational hegemon. And that's exactly the way the Chinese see it. As opposed to, Joe Biden says this is the century of democracies versus autocracies. Some of the funnier, more clever Chinese will say, no, it's the plutocracy versus the meritocracy. Which gets to the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party, the best way to think about that is the Chinese Communist Party is essentially the meritocratic elite. In the same way that if you look back through Chinese history, there was an emperor, and then there was the Mandarin class running the country. That's essentially what you have at the moment. And you don't get into the Chinese Communist Party if you're not very able. You don't get to Tsinghua University if you're not very able. 10 million kids a year take the national examinations to go to university. The top 3,000 of those go to Tsinghua University. 3,000 get admitted and 3,000 go. And so, and Tsinghua University accounts for 50% of the leadership of the country. So that the examination-based culture, which has existed for 2,000 years, still exists, and essentially, that's what drives the input into all these institutions. And so to put it in the vernacular, if you get to the top of the Chinese system, there's no chance you're not very smart and very able. And the only institution in this country, which is, to me, is at all like it, and when I tell them this, it drives them crazy, the only institution in this country that's at all like the Chinese Communist Party is the U.S. military. Which is to say that if you and I were 18 years old and we went to West Point together, and we went in the military and we stayed in the military, one day we're 4-star generals. We've known each other for, whatever it is, 40 years, and we're sitting around the same table. That's the Chinese system. And so they know each other intimately. They've had real jobs. They failed or they succeeded. If they succeeded, they went ahead. If they failed, they failed. And like all big organizations, there, of course, is plenty of rough justice and infighting and all the rest of it that goes on in every corporation in the United States and anywhere else. But that's basically the system. So I think the word communist kind of gets into the mental way of Americans understanding what you're dealing with. It's not a communist system, period. Which doesn't mean they don't have, when they talk about common prosperity, for example, you might say that's the equivalent of trying to fix income inequality that we would talk about. But the other day, another Chinese was saying to me, the capitalist system is essentially a divide and conquer system. The Chinese modernization is a unifying system. And so so Xi Jinping, to go back to him, he is determined, although they haven't figured out how to do this yet, that common prosperity is for real. They're proud of the fact they've lifted 800 million people out of poverty. Of course, that's the most ever in history by a long, long way. And they're proud of that. And they think those people ought to continue to advance. And that these big, big differences between the wealthy and the poor is too much. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's why you see them sort of cracking down now on some of that.
So on the one hand, the portrait that you paint is one of Xi Jinping and the Chinese government making successful strategic investments in market development internally and externally in terms of improving relations with other countries, supply chain robustness, hardening, resiliency, and America responding poorly to being beat out in these marketplaces, and whether it's a trade war, intellectual property threats, because we're worried we might fall further behind in certain ways. And to cover that up, or maybe not even to focus on that, there's the framing of the autocracy versus democracy, and there's the moral play that we should be focusing on. But a lot of Americans would focus on, well, we feel threatened because of China's policy towards Taiwan or towards North Korea or now towards Russia and potential partnerships there. How does your narrative around common prosperity fit into that foreign policy story, admitting that I've just picked 3 countries out of probably 120 with whom it has positive trading relationships, right?
Well, obviously, all of these topics are very complicated, but and what's so hard to know is when the 2 biggest countries, the 2 most powerful countries, start getting antagonistic towards one another, what's causing what, right? And it may not even be a useful exercise to try to figure out what caused what. But you inspire me on one other point I wanted to make, which is this. I had thought incorrectly that when Biden became president, we would have, for the first time in history, an asset we never had before, which was an incoming president who already had a good relationship with the existing Chinese president. So when Xi Jinping was vice president and Joe Biden was vice president, the 2 of them spent about 10 days in China together and 10 days in the United States together. That's a long time for 2 people of that seniority. So when Biden became president, he had a pre-existing, in fact, I would say those 2 have spent more time together than any 2 American and Chinese presidents in history. So I thought, incorrectly, that Biden, being a good politician, would realize his first phone call would be to Xi Jinping and say, looking forward to working with you, we can do this, that, and the other thing together, blah, blah, blah. He did exactly the opposite. They literally decided, no, what we have to do is we have to talk to everybody else in the world first, particularly the allies, get us all together coherently, and then talk to the Chinese. So about 9 months elapsed before Biden and Xi Jinping ever spoke. So then I started thinking, okay, now Biden says routinely, as all American presidents have recently, the U.S.-China relationship is the most important relationship of the 21st century. Of course, I agree with that. And so then if you kind of conceptualize the President of the United States as sort of the CEO of the country, and the CEO of the country has just said, okay, the most important relationship is U.S.-China. Now, if you were running a company and you had your key people around the table, let's say your cabinet, as it were, and that was your directive, you would think that everybody who's senior ought to be all over that topic, right? So now, I've often done this sort of thought exercise in my head. If you went around the cabinet table and you said to each cabinet member, tell me the name of your Chinese counterpart, I'll bet you 90% of them couldn't tell you. Let alone if you were to say, on a scale of 1 to 10, grade your relationship with your counterpart. The answer to that would be 0. So there's a fundamental disconnect here, which to me it's almost political malpractice. And by the way, I say the same thing about the Chinese. This goes both ways. I'm picking on our own country because it's more polite to talk about your own country. It goes both ways. I mean, it's completely intolerable. Obviously, we all know just through, this is like human relations 101, right? If you want to build a relationship with someone, guess what? You got to talk to them. And if you want to build any kind of trust or even diminish fear, the better you know him or her, the better. Or even if you're wanting to make a judgment on what do I think about person A, B, or C, isn't it a good idea to spend a lot of time with him or her? They're doing none of that.
So let me ask about that, though. I mean, I think, again, many of us might think that domestic politics determines and shapes a country's foreign policy. And I happen to think that that's probably true in the U.S. as well. Why? You told the story about Kerry and Obama and how Kerry was invited to join the One Belt, One Road initiative. I'd never heard that story before.
Yeah.
We'd be in a very different position today if Obama
By the way,
yes.
Kerry goes on to say, in life you have these missed opportunities. It's the single biggest missed opportunity in my life, politically.
I mean, it certainly has completely reshaped the international development world. The World Bank, the IMF are now second fiddles, really, to that effort. But let's try and understand how the U.S. got where it is today. Going back to Obama, Trump, Biden, why haven't we been able to do better? Let's diagnose the problem. What's keeping us from communicating more, or whatever it is we should be doing at this point?
It's a very good question. You know, I scratch my head because the consensus on China has become so overwhelming that if you say anything even close to being constructive, you're sort of viewed with a kind of suspicion. That's how bad it's gotten. So I don't know. Trying to deconstruct exactly how we got here is hard. Obviously, when Trump became president, and let me just say, Trump to me is, going back to what I was saying about Hofstadter, Trump is both symptom and cause. So if Trump didn't exist, the underlying politics are still there. He happened to have capitalized on them rather well. But the Trump story I know fairly well because I was, in the early days, I was quite involved with it. And you remember in the beginning of the Trump period, the fear then was that trade was going to be a real problem. Mm-hmm. And I was asked by the White House to help Lighthizer on the U.S.-China trade stuff. Mm-hmm. Because his counterpart was a person called Vice Premier Liu He, who I knew very well. And so I met with Lighthizer, and I said to him, Bob, oh, by the way, I didn't know him at all. And he had a reputation for being a real hawk. So I said, Bob, there's only one model of U.S.-China relationships that I know works. And I will call it the Kissinger, Zhou, and Lai model. And that's this. The respective presidents appoint somebody who's very senior, who's very trusted, and the two presidents say to the two people, metaphorically, get in a room and don't come out until you've got a solution. Mm-hmm. And this is exactly what Kissinger and Zhou and Lai did. And so I said to Bob, that's the only model that works. You absolutely have to follow that model. Mm-hmm. And what you have to do, you can't delegate this. You have to build a relationship of trust with Liu He. I've known Liu He for 20 years. He's a good guy. He did his master's at the Kennedy School. He speaks good English. He's an elegant man. And a very bright man. And I'm telling you, whatever the result would otherwise be, it's going to be better if you do it the way I've just described. And Lighthizer, to his credit, did exactly that. And the irony is, 4 years later, the trade channel was still wide open. So during the COVID period, for example, when the White House was telling American manufacturers of medical supplies, we need all your stuff, fast. And a lot of these American medical companies were manufacturing it in China. And because the Chinese COVID thing happened earlier, the Chinese government had done the same thing. They'd said to Johnson & Johnson, no, you can't export, staying here in China. So the American companies tried to tell the White House, well, we're happy to comply, but a lot of our stuff's in China, we can't get it out. And so they came to Lighthizer and to me to say, can you talk to the Chinese and get them to let the stuff out? So we went through the trade channel, and I said, we had a conference call with 5 CEOs of American medical companies. I said to them, you're going to think this is crazy, but I'm telling you this is the way to get it done. I need to know the name of the specific plant and the plant manager and his WeChat number. You give me that and I'll get it unlocked. And that's exactly what happened. But the reason I tell you the story is because notwithstanding all of the harumphing and all of the Sturm and Drang, that channel was actually very effective. Mm-hmm. But what then happened was Trump not having the discipline to kind of follow through on his original engagement with Xi Jinping, which, by the way, was very positive. And Trump kind of, he sort of engendered and was not at all bothered by a kind of a world of chaos. So he suddenly started hearing these speeches from Pompeo, Navarro, Pence, this person, that person. One was more hawkish than the next. And so this started getting worse and worse and worse. And then I think the domestic politics, the way that played out was, I think the Democrats decided that the very voters who Trump managed to pull away from Hillary Clinton, who simplistically were essentially middle class or working class, Midwestern, mostly white, mostly male voters, that those voters Biden was able to bring back. And those voters were on the very negative end of the China issue, and therefore we, the Democrats, cannot afford to let the Republicans get to the right of us on China. Therefore, both the Republicans and the Democrats are kind of fighting it out. Who's more hawkish on China? And then once that starts going, then it engenders all kinds of behavior, which I'm sure you've all experienced. You've seen, at the very negative end, you've seen a lot of sort of despicable behavior on the part of the government towards Chinese Americans, Chinese nationals, particularly in academic institutions. On the one hand, at the other end of the spectrum, you've seen people inspired to write and research, and some of the stuff's quite good, whether it's hawkish or not hawkish.
Right. Okay. All right. I want to invite the audience to participate now through Q&A. So if you'd like to ask a question, and I ask that you make it a question, raise your hand. Please identify yourself and state your question. We'll go. I guess the microphone's over here. We'll go here first, and then we'll come down.
Thank you for coming here and speaking with us today. I have a question. You mentioned the two systems, Westernization and globalization. And I'd like to hear how that differs from the Chinese perspective, how they view these two systems differently, and how come in places like Hong Kong and Taiwan that seemed, from an American's perspective, seemed to be Westernizing, and how that conflicts with the Chinese idea was it modernization? Modernization.
Yeah.
Forgive me. So yes, that's my question.
Yeah. Well, first of all, as I started to say before, the Chinese definition of what they're calling Chinese modernization has 5 central elements to it. I named 3 of them before. And they're all very sort of high level, macro. I would call them aspirational or inspirational. And I also said what I said earlier, which is, okay, if you say that you believe in these things, then you're going to have to be able to explain how does the Ukraine war fit into this emphasis on world peace? How does the behavior in Hong Kong, or the behavior in Xinjiang province, or the behavior vis-a-vis Taiwan, how do those fit into these things? And since they're just sort of rolling this out now, my assumption is, although I haven't heard the answers that you want to hear, I want to hear them too. I haven't heard those circles being squared yet, but clearly they have to do that. And I think that you may have seen, if you're following what's being said by the Chinese with respect to the Ukraine, you can see they're sort of starting to roll some of this out. They're saying, essentially, we're neutral, we're for peace. And we want peace to happen as soon as it can happen. And what the time has to be right, and the warring parties have got to be willing to be interested in having peace. But when that occurs, we're happy to be as helpful as we can be. So it remains to be seen what comes of this. I think that a foreign policy realist would look at this and say, this is all naive nonsense. Global powers behave a certain way, period, end of story. And they have for thousands of years, nothing's going to change. It's tempting to think, you'd like to think that mankind can kind of evolve. And that maybe, just maybe, you get to a point where the most powerful countries in the world actually at least aspire to have a peaceful world, and they work hard to maintain that. Now, who knows whether that can ever come about, but certainly the Chinese would make the case, and I think with some justification. If you look through thousands of years of history, it's been a pretty, what's the word I want to, self-contained, civilizational, relatively peaceful civilization. If you were to, one of the other parlor games I play in my own head is, if you compare the last 50 years, just to pick something, and you were to go year by year, 1973, 74, 75, et cetera, right to 2023, and you ask yourself one question: was this country at war, yes or no? You ask that question about the United States, it's close to, if it's not 50 out of 50, it's close. You ask it about China, I think it's 1 out of 50, 1979 in Vietnam. So it's not, that may be a little bit too clever, but I think that it's not irrelevant. And so now, on Hong Kong in particular, well, let me say one more thing. I'm falling prey to my own criticism, which is I try to stay away from hyperbole, but you get going, you get to, I would say to the Chinese, the way you should have managed Hong Kong, which you didn't, you should have managed it in such a way as to be reassuring to Taiwan. That should have been your criteria. What actually happened was they managed Hong Kong in the early period rather well, but after the early period they managed it terribly, and it came out as bad as it did. And of course, all it did was make the Taiwan issue significantly worse. So there's no monopoly on mistakes by any country.
So let's try and get a couple of more questions in before we run out of time. Why don't you had your hand up? Go ahead.
Yeah, hello. So, I'm Matyasha. I'm a PhD student here. One thing that I found particularly interesting was this remark you made about how China is basically completely absent from English communication channels.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Like, what is missing there? Because my impression is that, like, if they wanted to, they could break through. Like, they could get the people. What's missing there, really?
You know, it's complicated because I've had this conversation many, many times with senior Chinese, as recently as December, with the most senior foreign policy person. There are a couple of things. First of all, there's the English language facility. That's the most basic thing. And at the very, very senior levels, it's spotty. That's one thing. And the second thing is, on a kind of personal level, I guess there's sort of asymmetric risk, meaning not only have you got to be able to participate, but you've got to be facile with the kind of culture that exists among the English language media. So if you're there, let's say on Fareed Zakaria's show, you better be ready for serious questions, and you got to be able to handle that. That's the second thing. Then that can be trained. The third thing is, though, if you make a mistake, in the Chinese system, it's a classic under-promise, over-deliver system. And from the standpoint of any individual, making a courageous decision has got asymmetric risk. If you're right, you're not going to get a whole lot of credit. If you're wrong, it could be over for you. So I think that's another issue. And then I think that for all the things I've said that are positive, I don't think the Chinese have yet completely internalized how powerful that world is and what it does to them not to be in it. Even though it seems to be obvious, but when you're in an internal system like that, people, we've all seen that. We've seen that in companies. We've seen it just gets insular. It's very interesting. It's interesting to me though. It's odd.
Let's get one more question right back here.
John, thank you so much for what you have done for the Chinese people. As ethnic Chinese, I love my heritage. However, there's one thing that I beg to differ is that I think the Chinese economic miracle is the hard work of the Chinese people and the generosity of the United States and the rest of the world in spite of the Chinese Communist Party. So, and I think that right now, the two parties that are antagonistic against each other are the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, not against the Chinese people. So my curiosity is that given that the CCP controls all medium, Chinese people are not allowed to see any news, anything outside of China, whatever that's being broadcast by the party. What are the three key things that you and all of us could do to help the Chinese people to gain the understanding of the world? And I think that's the key to world peace. And if we get their mind share, Chinese people will be on our side. I am very sure about that. Thank you so much.
Okay, a couple of things. First of all, I've been teaching at Tsinghua now for 20 years. So I deal with and know a lot of young Chinese from that and from other ways. And of course, I'm dealing in a sense with, it's self-selected, I'm dealing with the most educated people. But at least among that group, I don't know a single one of them who doesn't know what's going on in the outside world. Notwithstanding your comments about Chinese control of media, 100% of them are connected 100% of the time, just like you and I are, to the world's media. So that's my first comment. My second comment is, I know that this line of, it's the United States versus the Chinese Communist Party, not the Chinese people. This has been a sort of a way of looking at the world that's been perpetrated recently by a lot of the, particularly Republican leaders. And it sounds good, but in fact, inside the Chinese system, as I said earlier, even to this day, I remember when I was teaching my very first year, I asked my students, what do you want to do when you finish? And of course, had you asked that question 10 years earlier, 100% of them would have said, I want to be in the government. When you asked it when I was teaching, this goes back 20 years ago. Even then, 20 years ago, the government was well down the list. So number one from memory, I'm going from memory, number one was a PhD in a Western institution. Number two was a PhD in a Chinese institution. Number three was work for a Western company and get trained. 4 was work for a joint venture company controlled by the Western company. 5 was maybe work for a highly successful Chinese private sector company, like Alibaba or whatever. 6 was work for the government, and 7 was work for Chinese state-owned enterprise. So even 20 years ago, the government was well down the list. However, because of the sheer numbers, the quality of the people going into the government is still very, very, very high. So I think it's a little bit of a sleight of hand to say you got the Chinese Communist Party on the one hand and the people on the other hand. The third thing I would say is, which is I'm sure obvious to you, the Chinese know a lot more about us than vice versa. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, including the fact that we're an open society. But another reason is because they've been studying us for the last 4 decades, at least, and we have not been doing the reverse. And if you were to take any kind of activity, like let's say, I don't know, numbers of Chinese students studying in the United States, number of Americans studying in China, it's 10 to 1. And even I would say, even among the elite here, their knowledge of China is very, very thin. And it's not true in the reverse. It isn't to say that Chinese can't learn a lot more, they can learn a lot more, but their knowledge is much higher than ours. So I guess my answer to your question is, I'm a big believer in what both sides call people-to-people exchanges, by which I mean a whole raft of activities, but what it basically means at its essence is Chinese people spending time here and vice versa. I'd like to see a lot more going the other way. I think that's the most powerful way to make a difference over time, and I think it does make a difference. We know that from our own personal experience. And as to what it does to the Chinese system over time, I guess I'll finish with that. To the extent that any external people or even internal people can have an impact on the Chinese system and the evolution of the Chinese politics and all that, for sure you'll have more influence. You've got the relationship and you built the trust. I once had in 2007, Xi Jinping for a short period of time was party secretary of Shanghai. And at that point in time, I'd known him for about 10 years. And he asked me to do a project for him, which was how to ensure Shanghai remains, or becomes and remains, a global financial center. And so I went away to do this project, and I came back to have dinner with him to report. And it just happened to coincide with, I was writing a very short article for Foreign Affairs magazine. It was maybe 20 pages long. It took me 14 months to write it because I wanted to be sure it was accurate. And So there were four of us for dinner. Xi Jinping, myself, the head of finance in Shanghai who had not met Xi Jinping, who was a mentee of mine, and then a close friend of mine who was also close to Xi Jinping. So Xi Jinping and I happened to arrive first. And he says to me, so what have you been doing recently? I said, well, I've been writing this article on the political evolution of China. Oh, that's very interesting. And he asked me a question, I answer. And I'm thinking, he's just being courteous. We sit down, he keeps asking questions. For 4 hours, all we discussed was what I thought I was learning about the political evolution of China. We never touched the topic of Shanghai as a global financial center, and their two friends didn't say a single word. The reason I mention that story is because so I have quite a good understanding in that one area of how he thinks. But the reason I mention it is not that. I mention it because I'll give you an example of something I did and failed in that discussion, which was I tried to say to him with respect to the rule of law. I said, it seems to me, as a matter of common sense, when you think it through, that maybe with the exception of a small number of categories, the rule of law is overwhelmingly in the interest of the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party. Because it's it's an area for redress. And that's good, because the Chinese Communist Party tends to be very responsive. Anyway, I tried that line of argument, didn't get anywhere. Now, but the reason I mention it, though, is because I genuinely believe, and it's been my experience overwhelmingly for years and years, that if you're going to have any kind of influence on the thinking of senior Chinese, for sure, you've got to have their trust, or you're not going to have a real conversation. And even when you have the real conversation, 9 times out of 10, you're not going to make any progress, but 1 time out of 10, you will.
Great power rivalry is like a chess game. Only by transcending zero-sum mentality can we achieve win-win outcomes. John Thornton reveals through historical insights, US-China relations are not just a bilateral issue, but a century-defining question for human civilization. As we seek mutual trust through cultural understanding and collaborative pathways amid shared challenges, perhaps we can break the historical cycle of Thucydides' trap. True wisdom lies in finding consensus amidst differences and building bridges through competition.